Muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Es un gusto saludarlos esta
Morning,
mañana.
all. It is a pleasure to greet you today, June 22nd, 2021.
Les damos la más cordial bienvenida a la Conferencia
We
Regional de
greet you
Reproducción
to the
del
member
Secretariado de
countries of the
Naciones Unidas
RCM.
a través de la
So any request
Secretaría
for reproduction
Ejecutiva de la
must be
ONU.
processed by the RCM
El día de hoy
Executive
comenzamos con
Secretariat.
los talleres de
We
formación
are
para el
going to
fortalecimiento de
start
políticas públicas
on the
migratorias
strengthening of public
para la gestión
policy
migratoria en materia
workshops
de no discriminación,
for
uso de la fuerza y
migration
retorno a los
management, for
individuos con
non-discrimination,
motivos
use
de
of
irregularidad
force,
migratoria.
and
El día de hoy
assisted return for
vamos a hablar
irregular
de
and
inclusión,
mass
igualdad
migration
y no
flows.
discriminación hacia las poblaciones en
Today,
contextos
we're going to start
de
with
migración.
equality and
Para
non-discrimination.
dar inicio con la
And to start
ponencia del
with
día de hoy,
this,
me complace darle la bienvenida y la
we
palabra a
are
Rocío
going to
González.
give the floor to
Ella es
Rocio
integrante de
González.
la Unidad de Política
She's
Migratoria
the head
y
of
Recursos
the
Humanos de la
Migration
Secretaría de
Policy
Gobernación
Unit
de
of the
México
Secretary of the
y directora
Interior
tempore del
of
PPT-MX.
Mexico,
Buenos días,
currently
Rocío.
holding the PPT. So,
Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás? Muy
Rocio,
buenos
you have the
días
floor.
a
Morning.
todos y a todas.
Welcome
Efectivamente, a
all
nombre de la
effectively
presidencia pro
in the
tempore
name
de la
of
Conferencia
the
Regional sobre
PPT of the
Migración,
RCM,
la cual ostenta la Subsecretaría
which
de
is
Derechos Humanos,
currently
Migración y Migración
held by
de
the
la Secretaría de
Subsecretary of
Gobernación
Human
de
Rights
México, a
and
cargo de
Migration of
Alejandro Encinas
Mexico,
Rodríguez. Les quiero
in
dar la
charge of
más cordial
Alejandro
bienvenida a esta
Encinas
primera
Rodriguez.
sesión
I
de
want
los
to
talleres de
welcome you to
formación
this
sobre
first session
fortalecimiento de políticas
on the
públicas de
training
intergubernamentales
on
para la gestión migratoria,
the strengthening
que
of
recordemos abordarán, como ya lo
intergovernmental
mencionaron, tres
policies
temáticas
for
relevantes para la
French
inclusión de las
migration,
personas que se encuentran en contextos
and
de movilidad.
especially for people
La
who
primera
are
sería
in
igualdad
context
y no
of
discriminación,
mobility. First would
valoración
be
del uso de la fuerza y
equality,
retorno a los individuos en
non-discrimination, use
contextos de
of force,
crisis. En
and
nombre de la
assisted return
presidencia pro
within the
tempore,
context of
es necesario
crisis.
declarar que estos
We have to
ejercicios
declare that
buscan
these
compartir las
exercises
experiencias,
want
pero
to
también
share the
ofrecen herramientas
experiences
para que
of
estos
the
temas
different
y temas
parties,
relevantes
but
se
also
mantengan en las
become a
agendas de los
way
gobiernos de
for
todos
these
los
relevant
países que
topics to
formamos la
stay in
región
the
y
agendas
que se
of
haga
all the
compromiso de
member
poner al
countries
centro de toda
with the
acción,
condition
programa y
of
política
placing
los derechos humanos de las
human
personas en
rights at
contextos
the
de movilidad.
center of all the
El
different
espíritu de
plans
estos
and
talleres es
policies. The spirit
reflexionar
of
en
this
torno a la atención que
workshop
brindamos a las
is to
personas
reflect
migrantes en el contexto
around
regional,
what we do
su marcha y
for
contingencia. En este
migrants,
caso, en la emergencia sanitaria
for
derivada por la
example,
COVID-19,
in contingencies
haciendo de
such
relieve la
as
necesidad sistemática
our
e ilimitada de
emergency due to
prejuicios que, entre otras cosas,
COVID-19,
asocian
which
erróneamente
includes
a los sujetos migrantes con el
prejudices
conflicto,
because
la
they
enfermedad, la
associate
desigualdad o el terror.
migrants with
Es momento
different
de
negative
fortalecer las
connotations,
autoridades en materia de
and
gestión migratoria, conociendo los
authorities
estándares y las
must
buenas
know
prácticas en
the
materia de
standards
uso de
and
la
best
fuerza
practices on
y
the
de
use of
retorno,
force
pero sobre todo
and assisted
para que estos
return,
busquen una atención con pleno respeto a
and
los
for
derechos
this
humanos,
to
que
be
en ideal
assistance in
caso se
full
convierta en
respect
una
of human
intervención
rights
total y exitosa.
and
Por
complete and
supuesto,
successful
agradezco la presencia y
integration or
participación de las personas
reintegration. We
funcionarias
thank
de los países miembros
all the
que en su
participants
quehacer diario protegen y
for
atienden directa o
their
indirectamente a personas
time,
migrantes,
all of them
refugiadas o
who
con necesidades de
provide
protección
direct or
internacional.
indirect
Asimismo, quiero
assistance
hacer un especial
to
reconocimiento
migrants
a
and
la Organización
refugees.
Regional
And I
para la
want to
Migración,
recognize
al
the
Comité
IOM,
Internacional de la Cruz Roja
the
y a la Red Regional
International
de
Committee of the
Civil
Red
y Centros
Crosses,
de
and
Migración
the
por su
R&COM,
colaboración en el
the
trámite
regional
de estos
network of
talleres,
civil society
los cuales
organizations
se
for
realizarán estos
migration.
días 22 y
These
23 de
workshops are
septiembre.
going to be held today, tomorrow,
Como es
and
sabido,
on
la migración
Friday.
irregular no se
You
elige,
know that
es
irregular
fruto
migration is not
resultado de
chosen.
factores
It
sociales,
is
políticos
rather
y
the result
económicos de
of
enormes injusticias
social,
y
political,
desigualdades que
and
orillan a
other
quienes las
factors.
padecen
And
desplazarse
those who
buscando
suffer
mejorar
them
sus
will
condiciones
be
en busca
forced
del
to
estatus,
leave
a
looking
desplazarse
for
para
better
salvaguardar su propia
opportunities
vida.
or even
La región es receptora de
to
grandes flujos
safeguard their own
migratorios.
lives.
La
The
mayoría
region has
provenientes de
many of
países de la
these
misma región, pero
flows,
también hay una importante
most of them
presencia de
from
personas
countries of the same
extrarregionales
region, but
en
we have
Chile,
an important
Haití,
presence
Cuba,
of
Venezuela,
extra-regional people
Colombia,
that come from
Ecuador,
Haiti, Cuba,
Venezuela
Venezuela,
y algunos
Colombia, and
países,
Ecuador,
así
just
como
to name a few,
extracontinentales
as
procedentes
well as
de África,
extra-continental
Ecuador,
ones
Camerún,
that come
República del
from
Congo,
places
Senegal,
like Cameroon,
también de África
Senegal,
tenemos que
Congo,
mencionar
and
la presencia
others,
de personas de Asia,
including
particularmente de la
Asian
India y Bangladesh. El
migrants,
periplo
mostly from
recorrido por los
India
países
and
extracontinentales, además de
Bangladesh.
beneficioso,
In
cansado y
addition to
desgastante,
being
lleva a las personas
very
migrantes a una
tiresome and even
condición de
dangerous,
inestabilidad
extracontinental flows also entail extreme vulnerability. Some of them will go through the Dominican Republic and will go until the Darien Gap to continue towards the US. Some of them will come with their families. Some women are also travel pregnant to see if their children can be born in the country of destination. That is why the Mexican PPT proposes the dissemination analysis of this information and regarding the use of force and assisted return has to be done so first responders or first line personnel have proper tools to assist migrants within a full respect of human rights with a gender perspective and taking into account the best interest of the child and intercultural aspect. We want to say that we have advanced with our work plan, and I would like to thank the different participants of the RCM, the dialogue that we've had in order for us to try to work on these shared problems and try to strengthen the frameworks of assistance for migrants within a framework of human rights. And today we are talking not only about the mandate, which is to strengthen the governance of mixed migration flow, considering the reality of the dynamic in the region and to promote strategies to manage this type of migration in collaboration with IOM, RNCOM, and other instances of the RCM. We are giving our progress to this work and especially to define processes to identify people that are in conditions of vulnerability. We have to stress the importance of cooperation mechanisms and multilateral agreements such as the Global Compact on Migration and the Sustainable Development Goal, which are charting a course for us, a roadmap. Because one of the other main issues with irregular migration is criminal activities like migrant smuggling or human trafficking. We know that smugglers will abandon migrants in the country of destination or will steal their resources. So this entails operational challenges for the member countries, and it is evident that these people are in condition of vulnerability. And sometimes we're not even clear regarding the best way to assist and who would be the authority in charge of different aspects of this assistance. So in this workshop, the starting point must be equal treatment to migrants. Given the dynamics of regular flows in the region and their constant mobility and long journeys. So to eliminate discriminatory practices has to be constant work carried out regionally, proposing agreements with assisted return. So to have clearer protocols and concrete analysis on degrees of vulnerability. The Mexican PPT invites you to internalize these multilateral commitments we have assumed as part of this conference. We hope that this work will result in action for equal and dignified treatment of everybody, regardless of their migration status. We wish you the best of success for today.
Gracias, maestra
Thank you.
González, por sus palabras. A nombre
Thank
del
you, Madam
Consejo,
Gonzalez, for your kind
como muy
words.
bien apuntó,
As
este
you
proyecto se
said,
realiza con el apoyo
this
de
is
RENCOM,
an
del Movimiento
activity
Internacional de
with the support of IOM, RNCOM, and the International Red Cross. Today, we're going to have the support of RNCOM. So I would like to give the word to Alejandra Macias, which is with Asylum Access Mexico, and she is going to talk about RNCOM. Alejandra, you have the floor. Dear representatives of governments, international organizations, and civil organizations, it is a pleasure for me to address you within the scope of this workshop on the strengthening of intergovernmental public policies on migration matters, non-discrimination, use of force, and assisted return vis-a-vis irregular mass migration, which have been organized with the support with the work groups and the regional network of civil organizations for migration. It is very important because the migration context has changed and increased. So cooperation and dialogue between states and countries, it is very important, as well as others that may shed some regional perspective on the matter. So we need to identify solution best practices and cooperation opportunities. Regarding this, I wish and exhort everybody to share ideas, have constructive dialogue, especially regarding the respect of the human rights of asylum seekers and those seeking refugee status. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alejandra Macias from Asylum Access Mexico. Also, Madam Gonzalez. Now, we are going to give some indications on this workshop. We will go with Rita Diaz of the Center of Migration Studies of the Secretary of the Interior, who is also in the working group of irregular mass migration. Morning. Thank you for this welcoming remarks. We are sharing reflections on the importance of these activities within the RCM. We think that before we go into the matter, we need to understand what discrimination is and why we are talking about it. It has been defined in different legal documents. We have one in our law. It says that discrimination is any distinction, exclusion, or preference by action or omission with or without intent, is not objective, rational, or proportional. So the result will be uh, annul or block the exercise of fundamental rights when based on one or other reasons like ethnic group, color of the skin, culture, sex, gender, disabilities, social condition, physical appearance, migration status, among others. So people who are being discriminated against, they have less preferential treatment, which does not allow them to have equality of opportunities and does not allow them to exercise the full rights like to education, health, justice, or work, among others. And we have groups that face more discrimination than others, like migrants. Also, LGBTQ community, children, the elderly, African descendants of or indigenous people, which can also be migrants and suffer discrimination. We need to think about the protection of migrants means that the right to non-discrimination is one of the rights that have to be respected within the context of migration. And this would entail that the actions would prevent any arbitrary, for example, actions that would be the result of discrimination, regardless of migration status. So going back, this is important because people will keep on migrating. We need to have assistance protocols in place without treatment without discrimination and with equality to create mechanisms that allow migrants to move in a regular manner with safety and security. It's important to talk about this because we think that training such as today's will allow us to have multilateral, bilateral cooperation and will allow our personnel to acquire tools that allow them to manage migration within the context of irregular migration mass flows, whose main characteristic is a great diversity of protection profiles. This is or sounds complex, but this will mean that each action will be in full respect and defense of human rights. And now this will be all. And we will start with the first part of the workshop where the ARNCOM is going to show best practices and opportunities that we have in migration and public policy regarding non-discrimination. We are sure that based on all this experience of the RNCOM, we will be able to make progress for migrants and even better if we do that in a coordinated fashion. So, Luis Alonso, you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you for this great introduction. We are going to give the floor to our colleagues from RNCOM. So we are going to welcome Julio, sorry, Julio Lopez. He is going to talk about equality and non-discrimination for populations within the context of migration. And then we're going to have a Q&A session in charge of Fidelina Mena from ARNCOM. So Mr. Lopez, you have the floor. Thank you. Morning. I don't know whether I can share my screen.
Bueno, no sé si ya está.
I don't know whether you can see my screen.
Bueno, buenos días.
You can put a full screen and we can start.
Perfecto. Ahí,
How about there?
ahí estamos bien.
Yeah,
Okay,
we're okay.
perfecto. Entonces, pues bueno,
So,
represento,
I
soy
represent
López, represento la red Clamor,
the
México.
Red Clamor
Clamor
in
es la
Mexico.
red latinoamericana y
It
caribeña de
is the
estados
Caribbean Latin American network of
del CELAM,
of the
Episcopal
CELAN,
de
of the
Pastoral.
Episcopalian,
Represento
of
de
the
cualquier manera la División
Council.
Episcopal de Pastoral de Movilidad Humana de México.
And I'm
Y voy a
also
hablar en
representing
temas
that dimension within the Republic of
bajo
Mexico. I
4
am
subtemas. En primer
going to
lugar, vamos
touch
a
on
abordar
4
las causas estructurales
subtopics.
de la migración
First,
en la
structural
región, la
causes
situación
of
actual de
migration,
migración
the
en
current
México,
situation of migration in
equidad y no
Mexico,
discriminación hacia las poblaciones migrantes,
equality and
así como
non-discrimination,
las violaciones a los derechos humanos.
and then finally
No
violation
me
to
recuerdan
human
cuánto tiempo
rights.
tengo.
Please let me know how much time we have.
Bueno,
Sí, perdón, pues si tenía el micrófono cerrado,
sí.
señor López. Sí, no, tenemos para este bloque
For
alrededor
this block,
de 35 minutos, pero
Ok.
sí hay que dar un tiempo, por favor, para las
and
preguntas y
but we can also give some time
Voy
for the
a
Q&A
tratar de
session.
ser rápido.
I'm going to try to do it quickly. So we're going to start, well, structural causes of migration, of course. Mainly, it is due to lack of opportunities. Irregular mass migration increases because we still have these structural conditions, including poverty, inequality, violence, the precarious situation of a great number of people, and their vulnerability to natural disasters and totalitarian governments. We also have issues with gender, mainly if they have a different orientation. We also have the phenomenon of human trafficking, a very profitable industry for the criminals who engage in it, and who will then try to deceive people so they can then be subjected to organ traffics, sexual servitude, or labor exploitation. So given the persistence of these conditions, lack of respect of human rights and violence, all these will derive migration. A study of ACLAC indicated that we have three main factors. One is the growth of the population, which has caused an increase of young people who want a job. And we have a lack of formal employment. Then we have the low wages and bad labor conditions. So many see in migration their only option
Señor López,
to
disculpe que
improve
interrumpa.
their life.
Recordar que hay interpretación simultánea.
Remember, we have
Igual, no se
simultaneous
preocupe, no se preocupe.
interpretation.
Puede hablar despacio para facilitar al intérprete. Y por favor, trate
And
de poner la pantalla
also,
completa de la presentación.
please try
Esto es
to
en
put the
el
full
abajo,
screen.
en PowerPoint, donde hay
Below in the
puntitas
PowerPoint,
en la pantalla. Más abajo en el mouse. Más
and
a
then
la
you
derecha.
see
Hacia la
there.
derecha.
You should see
Más a la
it.
derecha, abajo. Es como el último icono. Más, un poquito más. ¿El siguiente? No.
No tengo otro. A ver,
Es
permítame.
poner en pantalla
Lo,
completa la
a
presentación.
ver, déjame ver si lo puedo poner como.
Let's see.
No lo encuentro.
Igual, por donde lleva el mouse, más abajo, a la derecha, un poco más a la derecha. El siguiente icono a la derecha.
Next
Este es el
icon
último
to the
icono a la
right.
derecha antes del zoom. Después de comentarios, después
Ajá,
del normal. No, el otro. El siguiente. El otro.
No,
No, faltan dos. El último. No, el siguiente. Ese mismo.
Ok.
Muchas
Perfecto,
gracias.
ahí ya se ve.
Sí, señor.
Now
Muchas
better?
Perfecto, gracias. Disculpen que yo para la tecnología soy
And
malísimo.
No se preocupe, trabajo en equipo.
yeah.
Ok, entonces, veamos
So
cuáles
continuing with
son
this, let's look at the profile for migration.
testigos de que hay una
We
feminización de la
see
migración,
a
la incremento
feminization
del número de mujeres
of
que migran.
migration because
En segundo
women
lugar,
migrants are
los
increasing in numbers,
adolescentes
and children and teenagers
por
are also
la
forced
reunificación familiar.
to
Y
migrate,
otro
sometimes for family
muy notorio
reunification
es el
purposes.
de
Another one
población de
would
sociedad
be
joven, especialmente jóvenes entre los
when we're
18 y
talking
40 años,
about
es decir,
18 to
la
40
población
years,
productiva de
when
nuestro
we're talking
país.
about productive years.
Y no podemos
And we
descartar también perfiles
cannot
de pueblos originarios como producto del
neglect
desplazamiento forzado
or,
y la pobreza
or
aunado a
or
factores
not take into
externos.
account, for example, the natural disasters or certain people like indigenous people who are
Tenemos
also forced
la
to
situación
migrate.
actual
So the current migration
de la migración en México.
situation in
México es
Mexico
un país de origen
is because Mexico is a country of origin, transit, destination, and return, the four facets of migration, in addition to forced internal displacement due to violence, religious aspects, or even natural disasters. So stay at home was the recommendation that we heard the most during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, there was not a lot of heeding this advice within the migrant population. Although the flows decreased quite a bit during the pandemic, it did not stop. We have a lot of returned foreign nationals under Title 42, and the US government has determined to immediately return and without due process to any migrants because of sanitary safety issues. In addition to the MPP program, sadly called protection, implemented by the last US government, the use of Title 42 for immediate return of people for sanitary reasons generated a big increase of migrant population in the northern border. According to data by CVP, 69,000 foreign nationals were returned to Mexico by MPP, who were then scattered around the Mexico territory, and most of them were never able to have proper follow-up to their asylum request. Many of them then decided to return to the countries of origin or stay in Mexico in irregular situation. Unfortunately, Mexico does not have official numbers of the migrants received under MPP because they were considered as regular undocumented migrants. And this is even more worrisome because migration authorities have received these migrants, interned them in camps, but without data, without registering them. So we don't have a clear idea of how many we have. But CVP indicates that over 440,000 were returned to Mexico. Most of them, we don't know where they are or in which conditions. And these two phenomena have shone a spotlight on the vulnerable situation of migrants. Many of them were victims of kidnapping, and some of them may have been disappeared by organized crime, and in many cases, in complicity with public officers. In addition to the prohibition of being able to buy a bus ticket because they did not have an ID that would indicate their status in Mexico. Although there was an effort to create a diagnostic for assistance of people in context of mobility, Mexico's migration policy has not changed in the last 15 years. It is mostly contention and repression instead of orientation with a scope of human rights. The current migration policies has practices that still affect the human rights of migrants. There are no programs to regularize them, and we still have that trend for deportation. According to the data of political of migration policy of Secretary of the Interior for 2019, the National Migration Institute detained over 180,000 people, foreign nationals, of which almost 150,000 were deported. Also in 2019, 53,507 children and adolescents were detained, of which over 13,000 were non-accompanied, were unaccompanied minors. In 2021, the Mexican Commission of Refugee Assistance has reported that they have requested recognition of refugee status for 41,191 people, the highest number in many years. Also, in 2019, U.S. deported to Mexico 211,241 Mexican nationals, of which 10,500 were unaccompanied minors. About 82.3% of returning Mexican migrants, which means they were deported from the US, don't have us health care services, and about a third will find their first work in the informal sector. So the next section, we're talking about equality and non-discrimination towards migrants. Let's start with the concept note, which starts with the following. The need to guarantee the respect of human rights of migrants is part of the agenda of the RCM, which has been at the core of different initiatives over the years. The countries of this multilateral organization recognize that migrants have rights which have to be respected at all times, regardless of their migration status. So already we had a presentation. Let's see what discrimination is. Well, it means a differentiated, unequal treatment towards a person or a group of people in different aspects of life or social life as a function of one or more categories, whether they are real or imaginary, like culture, gender, age, or social class. Discrimination would be an action that limits or hinders access to the exercise of the rights of the people who are affected. The principle of non-discrimination is contemplated in in international texts such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Convention of 1951, and European Convention of Human Rights, which says that no one, especially those who are in vulnerable situations, like those susceptible of receiving international protection, shall be discriminated against for any reason whatsoever. Within the sphere of discrimination and asylum, we have a type of discrimination because of their impact, which is racial discrimination. It is defined by the first article of the Convention to eliminate all aspects of racial discrimination, which was held in 1963. And it's defined as any exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, origin, or ethnic or national origin, with objective or effect, which be to obstruct the exercise in equal conditions of the rights of the people and the essential liberties associated of in cultural, religious, labor, and other aspects. The flows of migrants from the Mexico to US, and especially foreign nationals who try to go to our national territory from the southern border, trying to get to the US, has grown because they're looking for opportunities of development. In the current context, political, social, cultural, then migration becomes an option, sometimes the only option to be able to improve the living conditions of certain populations, which have been compromised by political instability, violence, among others.
En- veamos un poco el marco jurídico del
Going a
no
bit into the
discriminación.
legislation
En
regarding
México, las
non-discrimination,
personas migrantes
Mexico
son
migrants
titulares de
are
todos los derechos humanos
holders of
reconocidos
all recognized human
políticamente por
rights
los estados
recognized
mexicanos
in the
en
Constitution of the
oposición
United Mexican
a
States and
tratados
international
legados y
treaties
ratificados por México.
signed and
El
ratified
artículo
by
primero
Mexico.
constitucional
The
reconoce de
first
manera amplia
article
y sin
broadly
excepción
recognizes
el derecho
without
de toda
exception
persona de gozar de
that
los
everyone
derechos
has the
reconocidos
access
por el
and
Estado
right
mexicano en la Constitución Política
to the
Nacional,
rights
en la
recognized by the Mexican
Constitución
state
Nacional
in
y
its
por esta ley.
constitution and
Ante esto,
as
los
well as
migrantes
the legal
migrantes,
instruments.
con
So
independencia de su condición jurídica en
migrant
el país,
population
les son reconocidos todos los derechos
has the recognition
de las
of all the
personas
rights that are
o
also
deben
recognized
de
to
ser
others.
o deben de respetarse.
So they have to be respected.
El párrafo quinto del artículo
Paragraph
primero
5
constitucional
of the
prohíbe
first
la
article of the Constitution
discriminación basada en el
forbids
origen
discrimination
social, por
based
lo que prohíbe
on
toda discriminación en contra de las
origin
personas migrantes.
and discrimination
El mismo
against
artículo establece que las
migrants,
autoridades tienen la
and
obligación
establishes
de
that
promover,
authorities have the
proteger y garantizar los derechos
obligation to
humanos de todas
promote,
las personas,
protect, and guarantee the
incluyendo
human
las
rights of
personas migrantes,
all people,
bajo
including
los principios
migrants,
de
starting
universalidad,
from
independencia,
the principles of universality,
indivisibilidad y de
interdependence, and
legitimidad, de
indivisibility.
manera que deben prevenir,
So
investigar,
they have to
sancionar
prevent,
y reparar
investigate,
en el
punish,
ejercicio
and
de los
repair
derechos de
regarding
cualquier persona.
the rights of anyone,
La
including
Declaración
their
de Durban
violation.
señala
The
que la
Declaration of Durban
xenofobia contra los no
indicated that
nacionales,
xenophobia
en particular la
against foreigners,
contra los
especially
migrantes, constituye
migrants,
una de las causas
constitutes
principales
one of the
del
main
racismo contemporáneo.
causes of contemporary
Todos los
racism.
migrantes son objetos de discriminación
Usually, migrants are
contra la
discriminated against,
violencia, la educación, la salud,
are
el
victims of
trabajo y la
violence,
seguridad social.
and have less
Estas
access to
condiciones
education,
afectan a
labor,
los
and
países de origen,
healthcare.
países de tránsito
This
y los
affects
países de
countries of
destino.
origin, transfer, and destination.
Los migrantes que llegan de forma
Migrants
irregular a
that
un
come
país
in
víctimas de la trata de personas son con
an
frecuencia
irregular
detenidos
status
por
are usually
establecimientos
detained
en
by the
centros
police
administrativos o en
and
prisiones
sent
o
to administrative camps,
instalaciones
prisons,
migratorias.
or migration
Aunque el
stations,
ordenamiento jurídico
as we call them
internacional de
here.
los derechos humanos
Even though human
propone que la
rights
privación
laws
de libertad
says
es
that
el último recurso.
the,
Sin embargo, los migrantes
the loss of
americanos
liberty should
detenidos
be the last
son parte de un
recourse,
proceso rutinario
um,
sin tener acceso
migrants
a
are
las
routinely
garantías
detained
judiciales
without
adecuadas,
having any
como por
access to
ejemplo su
legal
asistencia
safeguards,
consular.
including
Los
consular
centros migratorios de
assistance.
detención en muchas
Migration
ocasiones
detention
están
centers,
hacinados,
many cases are
por lo
crowded.
general no cuentan con servicios
Usually
básicos de
they
salud,
don't have
alimentación, saneamiento
proper
o agua potable,
food,
y muchas veces
sanitation,
tienen muchas
education,
veces separados para hombres y
and many
mujeres.
times the restaurants are not
Finalmente,
separated between men and
hay
women.
una tendencia cada vez
And
mayor
there's
a
also a
enjuiciar los
trend
delitos migratorios,
to
lo cual
criminalize
cada vez ha resultado
migration
en violaciones a los derechos de los migrantes.
uh, misdemeanors,
Dentro de los
so they're turning
aspectos
that into
irrestrictos de
criminal
los derechos
or
humanos de la
felonies,
población migrante
criminal
están los
actions.
principios en los
So
que se sustenta
this
la
one
Ley
of the
de Migración
principles
publicada
on which
en
the
en
migration
marzo del
law
2011.
published
La Ley de
in
Migración
2011,
reconoce
which is the
a
migration
las
law
personas
that
migrantes el derecho a
recognizes
la no
migrants
discriminación,
the right to
la protección integral de
non-discrimination,
sus derechos humanos,
the
su no
protection of their human rights,
criminalización
the
y la
non-criminalization of the
garantía de la
regular status,
independencia de su
and
condición
their
migratoria.
equal standing before the law,
El
regardless
principio básico de la
of
no
their
discriminación es un
immigration
derecho clave
status.
para
So
acceder a todos los
the
demás
right to
derechos.
non-discrimination
Mientras la
is key.
igualdad y no discriminación se
So
reconocen como
equality and
bases
non-discrimination is recognized
sobre
as a
las que se asentan
principle
los derechos humanos,
on which we have
la igualdad
human
es de la
rights.
forma
where equality establishes the way in which people can exercise their rights, and non-discrimination would be the need to protect people against arbitrary detentions or other types of discrimination. As we said, the Mexican state prohibits all discrimination due to ethnic or national origin or disability, social situation or class, religion, opinions, sexual orientation, marital status, or anything that can affect the human dignity. And this includes all people in Mexico, regardless of their migration status. So prohibiting this discrimination towards migrants is one of the requisites or the pillars of
Disculpe que lo interrumpa.
the law against
Tenemos
discrimination.
de 50 minutos.
When I said 45, 50 minutes,
En
it's
su
the
informe
total
pusieron
time that we
creo
have.
que también tienen lo de los casos prácticos.
So we
Pero
have
creo que
practical cases. So,
Entonces, dame 2 minutitos o
okay,
3
so
para
let's
hacer mi
close
presentación
this in
y
2, 3
pasamos a unas
minutes,
preguntas.
and we can go then to the questions that I want
El
to
derecho a la
ask.
dignidad humana.
The right to human
La
dignity,
condición de migrante no le resta valor
the
a un ser humano. Por tanto,
condition of being a
nadie
migrant does
tiene
not mean that
legalmente
anyone
para
is worth
garantir el
less.
derecho a
So
dar un
no
trato
one
de
has the right
inferioridad y
to
excluyente que
discriminate
discrimine a las
against
personas. El
this
paso de
population.
estadía por México no debería significar un riesgo
So
latente de
going through
violación de los
Mexico
derechos humanos ni
should
probablemente
not
de
mean a risk
integridad
of
ni libertad.
abuse
El derecho
or
a
any type
ingresar
of risk for these
en
people.
el ingreso
So the
no forma parte del
informal
proceso
entry
migratorio es un
in
motivo
to
para
the country,
criminalizar su
it is
actuar
not a
y
motive
tratarlo
to
como tal.
criminalize the
Ser
action of the migrants and
migrante
treat them as such,
no
as criminals.
implica
Being a
ser un
migrant does
delincuente.
not mean
El
being
ingreso
a
irregular y alarmado
criminal.
al país implica una infracción
Irregular
administrativa,
entry, it
no
is a
una sanción.
misdemeanor,
En ningún
not
caso,
a felony.
una situación de
In no
estado
case,
irregular prefigura
irregular migration
precisamente
status
la comisión de un
should be
delito
by
que se
itself a
considerará
felony
la comisión de
and
ilícito
should
por parte de la
prejudge
persona
the,
migrante por
the
el hecho
commission
de
of a
encontrarse
crime
en
by the migrant
situación
just
de
by being
migración.
in an
Este es el
irregular
artículo 2
condition or
de
status.
migración.
This is the second
¿Cuáles son los
paragraph,
factores
the Article 2 of the
y
migration law.
los
So
principales
what
factores y
of
ámbitos
the
de
main
discriminación que afectan a
factors
las personas
and
migrantes
spheres of
en
discrimination
México?
affecting migrants?
Tenemos
Mainly
la
would be labor
seguridad, la
discrimination, access to
vivienda,
housing,
educación,
education,
atención sanitaria,
sanitation,
el
which they're
género
excluded
como
from, or
motivo de
healthcare,
discriminación.
and gender
Los
as
ámbitos de
reason for
discriminación
discrimination.
son la discriminación laboral, el acceso a la
And
vivienda, servicios
those
sanitarios y atención
aspects
como motivo
are
de
still
discriminación.
prevalent.
Eh, lo voy a dejar ahí
And
y
we are
vamos a
going to
pasar
end
a
with
unas
the questions,
preguntas que quiero plantear y dejarlas
eh,
para la
which
reflexión.
I want them
La
as, let's
primera
say, food for
pregunta
thought.
que me
First one
planteo yo es
is,
¿qué mecanismos
what
efectivos de
effective
coordinación
coordination
entre las
mechanisms between
autoridades de
authorities at
todos los
all
niveles
levels
del
of the government
gobierno se
could be
pueden implementar
implemented
para atacar las
to
causas que
attack the
originan
causes
la
that
migración y para
originate
erradicar la
migration and
violencia
to eradicate the
para
violation of
restablecer los derechos de las
the
personas
rights of migrants?
migrantes? Segundo,
Second,
¿cómo
how can we
sensibilizar
raise the
a la
awareness
población
of public
pública,
servants,
especialmente
especially
aquellos que
those
viven en
who
áreas
work in
vulnerables,
migration,
para
to
propiciar un
foster
combate frontal contra la
frontal
discriminación
fight
migratoria?
against discrimination
Tercero,
of migrants?
¿qué formas consideras que
Three,
qué
which
reformas consideras que se requiere
reforms should be
implementar
implemented to
para
guarantee
garantizar
access
el acceso
of the
de las
rights
personas
or
migrantes?
access of migrants to the
Han
rights
sido bien
in
mencionadas
Mexico
en México la
or the
reforma
national
del
territory?
artículo
For
68
example,
de la
Mexico
Ley General de
reformed Article
Población, por
68
ejemplo, de
of the general law on
1997,
population,
lo
so
cual de
civil
autoridades
register
competentes y
and
ciudadanos
other competent or
responsables
pertinent
de
authorities
los
can
nacimientos de hijos
register
migrantes,
the births
no
of
importa sea la
migrants,
situación
of
migratoria
migrant
que
children,
para
regardless
dar un
of
ejemplo, cualquier
their
persona
migration status, with no
cuyos
discrimination.
hijos lleva su apellido
We
podrá
have
ser
someone
dotado
who
de
is
los derechos
undocumented, so he was
que
not
tiene un
able
padre.
to register his children under his name.
diseñar e implementar una
4.
política integral
Is it viable to design and
de
implement an
regulación
integrated
para
regularization
personas
policy
migrantes y sus
accessible
familias,
to all migrants and their families
regular
who are in irregular status
cumpliendo con el principio de no
by
discriminación
that complying
y
with the
la
principle of
normativa
non-discrimination?
en
And
términos
finally,
de combate a la
in terms
discriminación?
against the fight against
¿Qué
discrimination,
estrategia están
which
o van a
strategies
implementar
are
las
being
autoridades
implemented
de
or
Ecuador
going to be
para
implemented
dar
by the governments in the
acceso
region
a la vacuna
to give
COVID
access to the
a los
COVID-19
migrantes?
vaccine to the migrant population?
Aquí, por ejemplo, México
In Mexico, for
necesita
example,
para registrarse
to
Código Único de Registro
be
de Población o CURP,
you need, for example, in
al menos
Mexico,
de los
the
estados de la
unique
delimitación
registration or population registration
en términos
code
de combate
if you
a la
want to get
discriminación.
the
¿Qué
vaccine or you want
estrategias se
to
está
register to
implementando
get the vaccine, you need
para que estas personas
formal
migrantes
ID. So
no
what
sean
are we
discriminadas
doing
por ser
to
indocumentados y tengan el
make this
acceso a
vaccine
esta vacuna?
available
Muchas gracias
to
y
this
gracias por
population
la
without
oportunidad.
discrimination? Thank you very much.
Gracias a usted, Padre Julio
Thank
López,
you,
de la Red Clamor.
Father Julio Lopez
Eh,
from Clamor
Le
Network.
paso la palabra antes de que sigamos con la discusión sobre las
So
preguntas que nos
we
formuló
will
el Padre Julio.
continue.
Muchísimas gracias,
Well,
Luis
thank
Alonso,
you
y
very
muchísimas
much,
gracias
Luis
al Padre
Alonso
Julio López de la Red
and
Clamor por
Father
responder la
Lopez
RUCOM. Pues
for
realmente los temas
the
que
Clamor
hemos
Network, which is
abordado
part of
son
our income.
importantes.
This is very
En primer lugar, el
important as
entendimiento
starting
común
point.
de lo que
We need
implica
to
la
have
discriminación
a
hacia las
common
personas
understanding
migrantes
of
en
what
términos del
discrimination
ejercicio de
against
derechos y
migrant
la garantía de las
entails
condiciones de
regarding the
servicio de
exercise of
personas
the
en
rights
necesidad de
and
apoyo que
guarantee
se
of
encuentran en un contexto de migración,
being able to
situación
have
de
decent life,
proceso de
regardless
integración
of
de su lugar de
their
destino, si se
migration
encuentran en algún
status,
proceso de reintegración
of
en su país
whether
de
they're in the
origen.
process of
Y es muy
reintegration to
valioso
the
esto
countries
que
of
nos ha
origin.
compartido, pues
And it's
justamente
very
las y los
valuable
representantes de la
because
sociedad civil, que en
the
este tipo de asociaciones
representatives
se encuentran
of
en
civil
primera fila
society are
de
the
contacto
ones
con las
that are
personas
usually
migrantes. Por eso tiene
the
una
ones that
capacidad
first have
única en
contact
cuanto a interactuar
with
de manera
migrants.
cercana con las personas migrantes y
They
con sus propias
interact
necesidades.
closely with migrants and they know their needs.
Escuchando esta presentación, pues queda claro que la
So
participación de las
it
organizaciones no
is
gubernamentales también
very
es
clear
fundamental para
the
avanzar en esta agenda.
participation of
Es importante seguir
non-government
fortaleciendo estos
actors is
vínculos y
very
estas
important.
sinergias con el
We need
objetivo
to
de
keep strengthening
generar una
these
comprensión integral y detallada de los
relationships and
fenómenos
synergies
migratorios y con la convicción de que la
to address
discriminación hacia las personas
migration
migrantes desde una
phenomena
perspectiva regional se debe
and have a
abordar desde los
regional
derechos humanos,
perspective
como
that
se ha
treats this
señalado
from
en
a
la
perspective of
Constitución de la
human
región
rights.
que
The
está
region,
constituida por los países que
which
conforman
is
la Región de
constituted by
Migración
the
Irregular y Masiva, continúa
countries of the
presente
RCM,
como
irregular mass
afectación de
migration
derechos
is
humanos y
still
como
prevalent
condiciones estructurales y
because we
esenciales
still
que
have
requieren
structural
esta
conditions
migración,
in the
como
region
lo son la falta de
that
oportunidades, la
drive
pobreza,
this
la desigualdad, la inseguridad pública,
migration, like
las condiciones
insecurity, lack of
predeterminadas por el uso
opportunity,
de la administración
and
pública.
even
Esto es,
the
como lo ha comentado el padre
expectations
Julio López,
of
es
the new
desgastante
US
en situación de vulnerabilidad que
administration.
implica también la
So many
presencia de
people in
riesgos de
situation of
exclusión de género,
vulnerability
como lo son el
can be
sometimiento
preyed
de las
upon,
personas migrantes, la trata de
especially
personas,
regarding
la
with
explosión de los grandes
regarding
grupos hoy
migrant
que están por
smuggling and
encima de los
human
derechos
trafficking.
humanos de las
So we need
poblaciones en
to protect
contextos
the
de
human
migración,
right of
especialmente
populations
si
within the
se
context of migration,
garantizan a todas
especially
estas
if we take
poblaciones
into account the
afectan
discrimination against this
básicamente el
population
ejercicio de los derechos básicos
affects
como
their
son la
exercise
seguridad,
of basic
la
human rights such as
estabilidad, la dignidad
integrity,
y el
security,
bienestar. Ahora, me
dignity,
parece que
and
podemos
well-being.
pasar al segmento
So
del
we
día de
can
hoy
go
luego a pasar a
to
estas
the
preguntas
practical
profundas que nos ha
segment
planteado el padre Julio, que tienen la intención,
using
creo,
Father
de desarrollar
Julio's
a partir de
questions
preguntas de estas
so we
características.
can
El
start
objetivo es que
discussing
todos los
them.
países, que todas
The
las y los
objective is
representantes
that
de los
all
países
countries
miembros
and
podamos conversar,
representatives
tener un diálogo,
can
podamos tener
have
sus
a dialogue
perspectivas, intercambiar ideas,
with their
generar
perspective, exchange ideas, and
además
generate a
de una
debate
forma
that
general
in
de las
addition
recomendaciones en la
to
materia,
have a report
poder
with
nosotros
recommendations,
identificar puntos
also
de
to
encuentro,
serve
puntos de
as a
respuesta
way to
interesantes,
identify
queremos
common
saber
ground
exactamente cuáles son las
regarding this
estrategias que han
topic.
utilizado,
We
cuáles son las
want to
buenas
know what
prácticas que han
strategies the countries
identificado,
have
todo
used,
en materia de no
best
discriminación hacia las
practices,
migrantes.
strategies
Entonces,
for
si quieren
non-discrimination
seleccionar Luis
against
Alonso,
migrants.
pues más
So,
bien
Luis
podemos
Alonso,
generar
you
espacio
have
en este espacio
the
para
floor,
que
so
nos
let's try
orienten.
to make
Muchas
the best
gracias.
out of this
Muchas gracias,
discussion
Rita, por sus
space.
preguntas. Vamos
Thank you, Rita.
en esta segunda
In
parte a
this
dar espacio para
second
diálogo
part,
y para
We are going to use this for dialogue. We're going to give the floor to Fidelina Mena. She is with the Without Border organization, also part of RNCOM, and she's going to give us a couple of cases.
Fidelina, buenos días.
So, Fidelina, you have the floor. Thank you very much, and especially our colleagues from the different governments that are with us today, observers and civil society organizations. For us, RNCOM, we are proud to be with you because as a society and as civil society organizations, we are able to articulate and coordinate with different governments because the policy of RNCOM is always that with good relations and coordination, we will be able then to work together and make progress and advance. So today we are going to have three practical cases, two from Costa Rica, one from Mexico. It is part of the RNCOM Observatory, which is going to be for the different information. And today it's going to be a bit more with images. So I'm going to share a presentation to continue. Let's see. Yes. Okay, please have the full screen if you can.
Aló, Fidelina, ¿me escuchas?
Fidelina, can you hear me?
Aló.
Hello?
Rita, ¿me confirma si es mi internet o el de Fidelina?
Can you confirm whose internet is down? Yeah, we can hear you. So, Fidelina, let's do the following. We are going to project the presentation of Fidelina so she does not use so much bandwidth. Thank you. Sorry for this little glitch. Can you hear me, Fidelina? No. Okay, sorry. It changed network. Can you look at the presentation? Yes. So, the practical cases that we have with populations, both return and mixed flows. This is with government since the start of the pandemic for Costa Rica. It is the same as what Father Julio said. Our countries have seen an increase in migration flows. We have mixed flows. We have an increase in asylum seekers and requests for refugee status, and an increase in the number of women and children. We are going to present the case of Nicaragua, who were Nicaraguan citizens who were in Costa Rica, and it was coordination of humanitarian assistance. This is not even for public policy. This did not need a decree. This was because what Father Julio said, our countries are said, okay, stay at home, but let's call the country home, because we don't even know about their actual housing status, because many people had issues with housing or being able to buy groceries. Many people, for example, like maids, were fired, dismissed, and neither government planned it this way because they just came to the border. And in reality, it is because we have an issue with the first semester of countries trying to close border and putting in place sanitation measures because we didn't know what the pandemic really entailed. And this made migration flows even more complicated because they would leave Costa Rica, but they cannot enter Nicaragua. So they would be in, let's say, limbo in or at the border. So civil society organization, we saw that it was an issue of funds and of test COVID-19 tests because Nicaragua was asking for it. And they were not able to request it in Nicaragua because they did not have the entry. So civil society from different places, we got together and provided humanitarian assistance. For example, to provide some food and masks and like Purell or masks or gel alcohol. And we, the different organizations, we joined efforts to provide access to the test. We asked the government say that we can find the resources for it, but they have to coordinate with the other government to see what type of test would be um, acceptable. So the Ministry of Security and between the governments, then they indicated the type of test. We were able to get them at a lower cost and were able to have them carried out on site. I mean, they were returned to their country of origin. And the Organization of Civil Society, we coordinated these resources and so these people would be able to get their test. Very simple case and the dialogue with the government and civil society organization were able to get the money. It was a significant amount because we had a lot of people involved, but then you see the solidarity of civil society, the government, and dialogue in a binational manner. Now we have another situation.
Poco arraigo en Costa
And
Rica, porque
this
estas
also people who did not have roots in Costa Rica, but they have been people who have been for a long time that they were going through the border. They would go to the southern migration center and then wanted to continue to San Jose or the northern part of the country. So the government of Costa Rica allows them to go towards Nicaragua. Especially extra-regional migrants were able to do that, but it's no longer the case. So 400 migrants were stranded in the southern border with the pandemic. They were not able to move. We're talking about extra-regional like Venezuelan, Panamanians,
se les
Cubans, etc.
fue a
So,
colaborar. Pero esta colaboración no es simplemente porque
and
nosotros
this collaboration was not only with the civil society organizations, the government also saw this and they needed somebody to speak to some extra regional migrants to tell them in their own language that the border was closed. It's not that there was a scam. The borders were indeed closed. So organizations have everything. We have Africans and Haitians, and we had people, well, and in 2016, when we have mixed transit, had a permit for entry and transit or temporary permanence for migrants. Those who weren't into the country before the pandemic. This was an administrative resolution of 2016. This is free of charge. And the second one, and the temporary permanence permit, which was possible in just 8 days of negotiations. It is a permanent permit for temporary permanence, also free of charge, which they wanted to work, they needed to work because they had exhausted all reserves. So both those were in the southern border, and this was a very simple coordination process uh, to be able to have the needs of these population heard.
quiénes
So
eran
we had
las que estaban ahí, ¿verdad? Con todos los
a
controles.
study of the people who were there with all security controls. And now you see people would sign, have or submit the documentation for review. We had police and civil society accompanying them. And you had the process, the different teams, and even the teams went to where the populations were, and we documented them per family unit. And the resolution, if you can see this, and documented says 24. That was the 24th family group, mother, father, and one child. That was family 24. So they would then be able to go and have their data verified by somebody. So they would be in the system, and we had computers and printers, and then we would have, and they were also able to move because we did not want to have mixed transit people in just one person. We wanted to have people to be able just to go to one place and always in a coordination. And of course, they would be receiving humanitarian assistance like food, hydration, and they were going to a hot area, so they required a lot of water. I'm sorry. And we have, yes, please try to be a bit
Perdón.
slower, okay? And so we have a transit of everybody to have concentration of these mixed flows. We had, we have the data in the observatory. So the state provides information, and there's we had people from different parts like Africans, Haitians, Cuban, because we had a situation with Cubans, and since that we have proper coordination with, and we saw solidarity among them. For example, they would share with each other. So it was very interesting to see this solidarity. After that, they were transported. We accompanied them, and they went to the northern border. This is on the part of Costa Rica. We know that different countries have different negotiations, but coordination and the dialogue that can have between, for example, government and civil society, it is a very good practice. We would like this to be possible for everybody. So we have our colleague uh, uh, and Macias from Mexico. And I can continue the presentation for you if you wish. Thank you, Fidelina. I'm having a bit of unstable internet, especially with internet. And this is going to talk about best practices we've had with Mexico on the protection of migrant children and asylum seekers. And we are going to talk about some challenges. And regarding migration flows, we are going to talk about the increase we've had. We've had a lot of people being affected, and that the flows have increased, especially from the south to the north, mixed flows, and they come from groups. And the flows are complex with different profiles that may include refugee seekers, stateless people, victims of trafficking, economic migrants, and victims of persecution. We've also seen and we see families, unaccompanied minors, and we've seen that in Mexico, migrant children has also increased, and that would include about 20% migration flows. And the profile, we see that these are people that are coming from RCM countries. We also find extra-regional and extra-continental people with different cultures and languages and racial profiles. What we've seen in the border of the Central American countries and Mexico, well, it has been the militarization of the border. In Mexico, the southern border, and with this militarization, we see the military people who are the ones that have first contact with migrants. And we see that even though they lack training, especially regarding the respect and information of the rights of people or procedures for asylum. We also see Mexico as a country of destination for migrants, and in the organizations that work in Mexico, many of these people uh, that we assist have mentioned that they see Mexico as country of destination. I would like to see whether we can continue. I would like to talk about the strengthening of the asylum system in Mexico, which we also see as a best practice, more presence of the Mexican Commission for Refugee Assistance, because the personnel is becoming more professional, and we are expanding the presence of the Mexican Commission of Refugee Assistance. And we've seen the last months new offices. Right now we have 9 offices and in the country. And in this case, we see this as one of the best practices. and other best practices within the context of the pandemic. Mexico did not suspend asylum. We still have asylum requests being processed, and some of the cases have been processed. Then online was procedures or formalities were also enabled, and we modernized also some of the migration formalities. Some offices will issue permanent residence or humanitarian visitor cards, which for us is very good practice. And we need to standardize all this in all dependencies of the National Migration Institute, because each of the delegations sometimes work differently. So it is important to regulate these formalities. One of the pending aspects is that even though Comar is expanding the presence, and we have obstacles for people to be able to access this procedure. Sometimes there will not be the presence of in certain ports or ports of entry. And some people who require international protection have been returned. So we think it is very important that both migration agents and other first line personnel be able to recognize their situation and refer them accordingly. And this has to be then especially helpful if we don't have the presence of Kumar. And we would like the military presence in the southern border to have also training to be able to identify these profiles and refer them accordingly to pertinent authorities. Because military operations usually do not discriminate or identify those needing protection from those who do not. And well, we have seen an increase of their presence, and it is also important to say it is very important to have more resources for the Mexican Commission for Refugees. We have an increase in requests, and not all of them have been processed in the time frame stipulated by law, which is about 45 days. And many people have been waiting for over a year for a resolution. And the people who are waiting for resolution should have a migration document so they can have access to rights, especially employment, for example, access to the labor market, which is very important for these people. And from uh, for protection of children, we have one of the best practices, and we've seen this in this sense. The previous reform that we had in November of last year, children should not be in detention centers. And in this sense, we are improved in the referral of children and teenagers for protection systems at local, state, and federal level. including Office for the Children's Protection. This reform of 2020 is a very good practice, and there are still a lot of alert. And we need to implement this reform because that is the issue. We still do not have enough uh, access or resources to be able to implement this reform, and that we need specialized personnel, and that we need children and their families to be included. Children in Mexico are no longer being sent to migration stations, but due to lack of space, there are other spaces that are might not be meeting all requirements for a decent space for these families. And some children and their families have been sent to schools or auditoriums. And so it is important to keep assigning resources. And the plans for the restitution of rights are not always including an individual cases. So it is important to study each cases, especially taking into account the best interest of the child, because we have these gaps that have even resulted in the deportation of families and of children, which could have been subjects of international protection. Family reunification is also a very important issue, especially those that are separated in different countries. We have children and teenagers that are being persecuted in their countries of origin, but they are now in Mexico. Their families are in the United States, so they have no one in Mexico. So we need to create mechanisms to guarantee the family reunification of these children and teenagers with their parents. And for them, I mean, they do not need to stay in Mexico. What they want to is to be with their parents. So these would be the cases we have for Mexico. So we might go to the questions. And one of the main questions is how we can create multi-sector strategies to assist migrants who are discriminated against or in vulnerable situations have to be protected with specific policies, and regularization policies are best practices. And we would like to see how we can replicate these best practices. So if you want to continue, Fidelina.
Muchísimas gracias, Ale. Sí,
Thank you.
efectivamente las preguntas, ustedes pueden ver, son pues
And you can
amplias,
see
pero
are
en
very
realidad
broad
la sociedad
questions,
civil, el sentir
but this
despertar
is
civil tan
what
amplio,
civil society
quisiéramos
would
nosotros
like
pues estar de la
to
mano con los gobiernos
ask.
para ver cómo podemos conseguir, cómo
So
podemos lograr,
how
cómo
we
podemos
can
colaborar,
create,
ya que
collaborate,
entre todos pues hacemos las cosas mucho mejor, ¿verdad?
because
Entonces,
together we
la
can
otra
do
pregunta,
things
¿verdad? Que
much
nosotros podríamos
better.
indicar
Another
es
thing that we can
cuáles son las
indicate
posibles formas de
is the
regularización
possible ways in
para
which
aquellas
we can
poblaciones de flujo migratorio económico
regularize
que tienen poco arraigo en la
these
región.
populations that
¿Por qué
have
digo poco arraigo en la región? Porque vienen, ¿verdad?
no
De
roots in
otros
the region,
países
because they come
del
from other
continente de
countries,
nosotros
or another continent and they don't have people in the current country or in our RCM countries. And so they don't have a safety net there. But we should be able to welcome them, integrate them in need so they can obtain, let's say, more formal employment within the profiles. We're talking about knowing the profiles. For example, we have people from Sierra Leone who were farmers, sugarcane farmers, let's say. We know that part of the region, we do have sugarcane, so we could collaborate with them. And so how these profiles could meet, for example, certain sectors of the economy and make effective the recognition of the human rights of these people to guarantee their rights as if there were others. So these broad trigger questions, and it is something that we would like also not only to discuss, but some governments to indicate, for example, that if they have some best practices that could accommodate one of these questions. What can we do, for example, for the different aspects that we are covering in these questions? Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Fidelina. Pues la invitación está abierta. Más bien,
So we have an
Fidelina y
open
Alejandro,
mic.
que se queden en línea. Y más bien, Fidelina, si puedes dejar las preguntas
And
en el chat,
Fidelina,
recordarles que
please
estas
leave
preguntas
the
también
questions
subimos el
on
día
the
de ayer
screen.
para
We
que las pudieran incluir.
also shared them yesterday,
Quiero darle la palabra a las
but
autoridades del
we
gobierno
would
para
like
que hagan
to give
referencia
the
a esta
floor to any government authorities
información.
if they
Pueden
would like
preguntar
to
al
refer to these
micrófono o
questions.
levantar la mano o anotar su consulta en el chat.
And
Así que esperamos su participación.
so we are waiting for your participation.
Adelante, Graciela.
Graciela, you have the
Graciela
floor.
Martínez, si se presenta por
Graciela
favor.
Martinez, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Gracias, buenos días. Mi nombre es
Thank you.
Graciela Martínez de la
I'm
Unidad de
Graciela
Política
Martinez
Migratoria de
from
México.
the Migration
Y
Policy Unit of Mexico,
reflexionando sobre estas
reflecting
preguntas, detonadoras y
about
presentaciones que nos hicieron
these
hace un
questions
momento,
and
me
presentations.
parece que hay como muchos
I
puntos que hay
think
que poner sobre la
there are
mesa.
many things
Y
that we
uno
have
es diferenciar los flujos
to
y
discuss. Once
diferenciar
we
cuál
have
es
to
la política y
differentiate
la
the
intención que se tiene
flows
con estos flujos.
and the
Porque
policies for these flows,
pues no es lo mismo
because
hablar de
it's not the
flujos
same
irregulares
when we're
en el
talking about
caso sobre todo de México
irregular
como en
flows
tránsito y en el caso que nos
of
presentaban de
people in
Costa Rica
transit or
de
in
una
Costa
política de
Rica,
acompañamiento a lo largo del
of
territorio
a
cuando
policy
son
of to
flujos
accompany
pequeños
migrants across the
cuando
territory when
tienen
they
una
are
dimensión mayor los
small flow
flujos y cuando se
compared
tienen
to large
contextos
flows
diferentes en las fronteras.
or
Para
different
Costa
contexts
Rica no
in
representaba
the
ningún
border.
problema pasarlos de una frontera a otra
From one border to
porque
the other,
pues
Costa Rica
había
is not
una
such a big
continuidad con
issue
el segundo
because
país.
there
En el
was a
caso de
continuity
México
with
estaría
the
la
other
posibilidad y se
country.
podía ver por qué, porque teníamos una
There was
frontera donde
no
cerrar.
possibility
En ese
because
sentido, me
we had
parece
a
que los
closed
contextos
northern
y las dimensiones
border.
son totalmente distintas
So
y
the
son de tal
contexts are
forma
different.
que hay que
And are
considerar en
some of
una,
the things that we
digamos,
have
en
to
una política de
consider
tratamiento para
in
estas
a
poblaciones.
policy
La otra
regarding these
es
populations.
que hablamos de flujos irregulares
When we're talking about irregular
y
flows,
tenemos que tener conciencia que hay
we
flujos
have to be
irregulares
aware
sin
that we
identificar
have
y flujos
irregular
irregulares que
flows
solo van de paso por los países.
that
En
are
este
going to the
sentido,
country
la política de
and
inmigración
others that
no
go
puede ser igual,
through the country.
dado
And
que
the
los que
policies
van en
cannot be the
tránsito no se
same because
pueden
those
integrar porque un
are in
proceso de
transit
integración implica
are
tiempo.
not to be
Tiempo
integrated because
que no va
that
a pasar
takes
esa
time.
población de tránsito. Entonces, me parece
Time
que una
that
de
this
las
population
discusiones
will
tiene
not
que ver
spend
cómo
in the
diferenciar
country
a
because
estas
they're
dos
going through.
poblaciones.
So we should
Finalmente,
differentiate these
tanto
two
regulares como
populations.
irregulares
Both regular
pueden ser
and
muy
irregular
vulnerables y
can
además
be
sujetos
vulnerable
de
populations
discriminación
and
y
can
o
also
consideración
suffer
de discriminación.
discrimination
Y esto me lleva
that also has to be taken into account. And this brings me to regularization. Usually, these policies are for those who are residing within the country's territory. We can have very good regularization policies. In Uruguay and Paraguay, you can be open about it. There is no charge. That also gives you the possibility to work. And so there is no discrimination. So that is usually for residents. Those who are going through regularization cannot be applied in the same manner as for residents. So we should go for a documentation policy. It's not to guarantee this solution to irregular flows, which is usually the one going to the US. And the best process would deal with documenting these flows. And we need a regional agreement on that. We cannot document in a country if we know that the next country they will not be able to get in. So the documentation should be for all countries. So the migrant can go through all of them in an orderly fashion. So we have best practices that may be replicated in some places, but not in others. And we needed then to integrate the flows in a separate fashion. This is what I think. Thank you, Graciela, for the comments. Many elements that then we can discuss. Any reactions from any other countries? We have Arncom, Benicio. Thank you, Luis Alonso. Greetings to all. Just a reflection regarding the cases that were being commented for us. Very important because they indicate a solution, an immediate response, because the pandemic really took all of us by surprise. We're talking about society, international organizations, governments, but they say that we can do things that can be solutions without having to go through red tape. Not everything has to deal with closing opportunities, whether at the border or formalities. And we think that the articulation of dialogue can provide better opportunities to migrants. So we really thank the opportunity for this exchange. So we have member countries, so representatives who can join this discussion. You have the floor. Alejandra, were you going to add something else?
No, perdón, por error,
Sorry.
perdón.
So we are inviting member countries who want to refer to this. You can open your mic or use the chat. So we can have an open discussion. So if you have any observer organizations,
Sí, estamos en este espacio de discusión.
We are in the discussion space for this first virtual session for the strengthening of public policy. We have equality and non-discrimination for populations in the context of migration. This is the space for discussion, for dialogue, based on what we have on the screen. Or if you have any specific question, as we basically heard from Clamor Network or other members of our income. Gustavo,
Luis Alonso, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás? Buenos días. Muchas
how are
gracias
you?
a Rocom, por supuesto,
Thank
por
you,
su,
Arancom,
invaluable,
for your
contribución, ayuda con esta
invaluable
presentación, con este primer,
contribution
con este primer taller. Tratando de
to
responder
this
justamente
first
estas preguntas, buscando,
workshop,
digamos, estrategias regionales, porque
looking for
habría
regional
que
strategies.
pensar que ese
We
es
would
el
have
objetivo
to
de la
think
conferencia regional
that
de
this
migración,
is
construir
the objective
estrategias de
of
corte
the
regional que nos permitan atender
RCM, regional
el fenómeno
strategies
migratorio en su conjunto.
to be able to
Vamos
look
a tratar
at the
todos
migration
en
phenomenon
esta reunión que desde el grupo
as
de
a whole
migración irregular y
and
masiva, que es
from
quien
the
también
irregular and mass migration group.
estamos, digamos, tratando de construir una
We are
estrategia de
trying
atención
to
a
build
la
a
migración
strategy to
irregular y masiva,
provide assistance
particularmente con base
to
en
regular and
intercambios con
mass
el resto de los Estados
migration
miembros,
based
tratando
on
de
exchanges with other member countries
generar
to
elementos
try
comunes
to
para la
generate
atención de las personas
common
migrantes.
elements
Hemos
to
escuchado ya
assist
en esta primera reunión
migrants.
que hay varios elementos que están
We've seen different
generándose. Por
elements
supuesto que
in
existen
this
procesos
meeting.
estructurales que motivan la
We see,
migración.
of course, structural causes for migration.
Digamos, estos procesos
Secondly,
estructurales motivan la migración y por
these
supuesto las
structural
personas que migran en
causes
situación irregular
will drive migration many times irregularly, and those who are forced to migrate irregularly
los pone en riesgo
are in vulnerable situations. They are not visible
los arriesga además
to the
a la
authorities,
trata y el tráfico de personas migrantes. Recuerdo que
and
durante reuniones
they
pasadas
can
también
also
tuvieron
put them
la
at risk
intervención
of
de que quizá la
smuggling
movilización de
and
estos migrantes,
trafficking.
digamos,
And we've seen that the border
sobre todo en la
management
región
working
de
group
combate al tráfico
has
y trata de personas migrantes, reconociendo por
stressed
supuesto
the
que
fight
este
against
parece
migrant
uno de
smuggling and
los
human
objetivos
trafficking,
de
and
discriminación y todo,
to
digamos, los
try
ataques a
to
los derechos
manage
orientados a las
the
personas
issues
migrantes.
or
Uno
fight
de ellos tendría que ver el
discriminations.
combate también
One of these actions
digamos,
would be
a
to
quienes se
fight
dedican al tráfico y trata de
those
personas migrantes.
who
Justo
deal in migrant smuggling and
decía
human trafficking.
Graciela Martínez,
And as
consideramos que este
Graciela
proceso,
said,
digamos,
we
hay dos
consider
distintos procesos. Uno, por supuesto,
that the
el de
processes,
documentación,
we have
donde cada uno
two
de los países de la
different
región
processes.
deberíamos
One
preguntar
is
hacia
documentation
quiénes son las personas que
that
llegan a cada uno de nuestros
where
países,
we would
cuáles son las
have to
condiciones
know
en las
who
que
is
entran. Nos
entering
parece que es
our
muy
countries
importante saber
and the
sus condiciones
conditions
y
in
contar con su
which
documentación
they
y
are
después con
entering.
base en
For
ello
example, do they have
construir las
documentation or
estrategias
not?
necesarias.
And based
En
on
este
that, to
proceso
build the
de
necessary
documentación, un segundo proceso,
strategies.
por supuesto, tiene que ver con el proceso de
And
regularización.
also with the process of regularization.
Graciela Martínez, de las
As
personas
Graciela
que ya
said,
residen en condición irregular
the
en cada uno de los
people
países, pero
who
por
are
supuesto
already
de aquellas
in a
personas que
country
requieren
irregularly, they have to be taken
necesidades de
into
protección
account,
internacional y sobre todo
but
aquellos que
there
se
are
quedan
others
en
who
un país
require
donde está
international
restringido por
protection.
alguna u otra circunstancia, dado que quizá su objetivo no era llegar ahí, sino
And
más al norte, y sin embargo
maybe the
cumplir otras
objective is going
circunstancias
to the
son
country in the
vitales
north,
importancia. Y por
but
último, y como
they
parte
may
de
have
todo
to
este
stay
proceso
due
está,
to different
por supuesto, la idea
situations.
de
And
generar
underlying all this
estrategias de
is the idea
integración a las
to
sociedades de origen.
generate
Es decir, es un
strategies
gran
for the integration into the
panorama
host
el que se nos
country or
presenta, es decir,
society.
desde el
It
proceso
is
de
a
documentación
complex
por algunas circunstancias
panorama.
de
It's
que
a
la entrada de
complex
personas
scope.
migrantes
We
en situación
have
irregular,
people
hasta
entering
los
irregularly,
procesos de integración de
and
algunas
we
de estas
need
personas
to
que
go and
deciden
provide assistance, including
incorporarse a las sociedades de origen.
integration
Nos
processes
parece que
if
este
they decide to
trabajo
integrate
del
themselves
CDMX y con
into their
particular
host
del grupo
countries.
de migración irregular y masiva sería de
So the
interés
working
saber
group
cuál es la
on
relación
irregular and mass
con los
migration is
países miembros, precisamente,
something
digamos,
that we
a través
are
de
exhorting
procesos
the member countries
prolongados, no
to
solamente
consider these
procesos de
long
contención o procesos
term
de
processes,
contención,
not
sino
only
procesos de
contention or
legitimización,
documentation,
pasando por
let's go from documentation to regularization and even possibly integration of those migrants who wish to stay in the country. And also to give some answers to the questions that are being uh, stated and which we have on the screen. On this multi-sector strategy, it is very important in each of the countries that different sectors of society, in addition to the government, to participate. It is impossible for one sector or another sector to take care of everything, documentation, assistance, and protection. And together with this multi-sector strategy, we should generate strategies with the objective of protecting and building non-discrimination processes. At the beginning of today's session, we were commenting, and it's very important to stress one of the very important things is to think that migrants can have vulnerabilities. For example, they can be a migrant, an LGBTI member of the LGBTI community, and for example, an African origin. So you can have compounded, let's say, vulnerability. So the different offices of the government should take that into account in order to protect them. To try to delineate these answers. And what we've been saying from Irregular Mass Migration Working Group, and we need the member countries, and we need to keep on the activities for the protection of migrants. These are integrated activities, and the results of them will match the assistance with human rights perspective that we should be providing to migrants. That would be all. And I have Guatemala, whether you want to take the floor or in the chat. What are the pillars of a regional integrated migration policy? So, do we have any answers to this question from Guatemala? And then we would go with Miguel Aguilar and a question from Honduras. So either you want to take the floor or we can read this question, the pillars of this strategy.
La idea es de que
The idea is that all the countries of the RCM, we need to establish a policy on mass migration, especially the caravans. We need to have some pillars of human rights. So, and what's most important is to protect those who are in vulnerable situations, such as children, and who were in also going through transit areas. While in transit, it is very difficult to document them. For example, in the case of Guatemala, refugees or regularization, we see these that this is not as feasible, but regionally speaking, as the Guatemalan Institute of Migration, we think we need to have a migration policy that is regional in scope to deal with this particular issue.
claro de
And we still don't have a clear concept
pero sí es
about these
importante
caravans, but it is very
con la
important
definición
to start with the
de los
definition,
pilares para crear una política migratoria regional. Gracias.
especially to create a regional migration policy.
Muchas gracias, don Rolando, por la pregunta. Quisiéramos ver si algún país o la ROCOM quisiera referirse a esta pregunta de don Rolando.
Would any
como comentario.
UNCOM
Bien.
country would like to refer to this?
Yo creo que la pregunta es sumamente importante, difícil de contestar en un par de minutos.
Well, this is very difficult to answer in a couple of minutes, but there are a couple of elements that should be highlighted. But for regional migration policy, have to go through an analysis of the different profiles of the migrant population. For example, the diversity of migrant population, when we're talking about families, children, other populations such as indigenous population or LGBTQ, and we need to respond to their different needs. But if the response gets more and more separated from the root cause, we are trying just to answer to the symptoms and not to the cause. The states, when we're talking about private sector, social organizations, communities, governments, etc., we all have to analyze in depth what is actually going on in our territories for people to continue to leave or being forced to leave. The same answers of more detentions, more military response, etc., has not yielded any results. We are spending millions without achieving the results we want for people to have better living conditions in their countries of origin or where they want to reside, and trying to avoid the current dynamic. I'm talking about any type of migration. The response has to be integrated. We need to find answers within the countries. We've had efforts for years of integration, and we still don't find a solution for that. Finding for that is reflection, analysis from the visions of each. As Julio said, we need to be open to listen to each other, to find an answer for each other. So we find a solution to this forced migration. Thank you very much. Miguel Aguilar from Mexico. Hello. I have an issue with my camera. It's going to be a bit general comment on the participation. On the question of a regional integrated policy, there are elements that we can start from. I mean, there are some pillars that may be an essential condition. For example, international cooperation. What we've seen in the Secretariat of the Interior, shared responsibility, for example, for us, shared responsibility is one of the pillars, if not the pillar, because the first integration is subject to where they come from and how we are participating as countries in the region, how we can implement joint participations or actions, and we have a need that has to go beyond the state to deal with the actions that we have. Another thing that is essential, and it is something possibly more personal, is even to ask ourselves what the region is actually defining, and if we are going to increase or decrease the region. Do we, for example, include other countries in the region? For example, Cubans or Mexicans or Dominicans that are coming to this country, are they integrated? Have they installed themselves in the country? Also, migration, irregular migration, and the institutional capabilities are also some things to take into account. And the countries have to participate in the different dimension because it will allow us to have very clear distinction between risk and vulnerability. Dr. Martinez said that both regular and irregular are at risk. It is true that vulnerability is much greater for irregular processes, especially if they fulfill certain characteristics where you have a compounded vulnerability situations, unaccompanied minors from certain nationality, race, etc. The possibility even that could be a geo-referencing of the vulnerabilities. We did a similar exercise in Mexico. We did routes where we have migrants going through that irregularly and where they can find the risks or where we see felonies or criminal activity being committed. Finally, and to close my comment, we had distinguished at some other time at the RCM that it was very important for Mexico that before integration we need other processes, inclusion and assistance. We're talking about transit migrants, as Graciela said, they don't have the means to integrate to society, but they do need assistance on certain degrees of inclusion. So we need to see these nuances, to see the level of participation of the different actors and their level of participation. And we have some things that could be pillars of our regional policy on what we think it's a process to understand the migration process in their different dimensions. Thank you. Thank you, Miguel. We have then Cesar Rios. Thank you from the Salvadoran Institute for Migrants. Very interesting to follow these reflections on a regional migration policy where we see more elements being taken into consideration. We have external factors that are affecting the design of a migration policy, but we also see internal factors of each of the countries that are characterizing both the country and the region in this matter. We have countries that may have a direct influence on being able to define things jointly. For example, politically speaking, in each country, we have elements of levels of corruption, for example, of democratic institutions and the power of the states, which will have a strong effect and have marked differences between countries. For example, if we go with the Northern Triangle, differences in levels of corruption, democratic institutions, governance, and if we measure degrees of corruption and we can see very clearly differences observed in the countries from which more migrants are coming from or the greater levels of corruption. So you can find some correlations. There are things that are marked in the dynamics of the countries and which can have an effect on the external attitudes towards them. For example, the previous US administration, while looking for solutions,
la falta de diseño de
they
acciones
had a lack of actions to deal with the region as a whole and decided to have bilateral negotiation. So basically exacerbating certain differences between them. So take into account external and internal conditions and the levels at which we are facing in terms of this topic. We need to then unify criteria so we can have a regional policy. Thank you, Mr. Rio. Greetings to El Salvador. We also had a comment from Honduras. Glenda Maredaga, whether you would like to take the floor, or it was just to complement the question of what Guatemala is saying, that the multi-sector strategies, we need to participate all sectors and design routes for suitable assistance with financial resources available. So Honduras, if you would like to expand, because this certainly entails policies and the approach or the integrated approach of migrant policy, not only at the national but also regional level. So Glenda is looking at assistance that cares and the financial resources to be able to provide them.
Quizás en lo que
Adelante,
salen
Vinicio.
otros comentarios para ampliar un poquito esta
A
última.
comment to expand a bit on this last reflection by Glenda, and Fidelina was mentioning it, when it was necessary to back a joint strategy between civil society, government sector, or private sector in the flow of Costa Rica's from Panama, including extra-regional extra-continental flows. We were able to do it. International cooperation, we could say that the problem is not so much financial resources, but we are not aiming at an integrated response or sustainable response. What we are dealing with is population that will need assistance and protection, and that will not. And I think that we have to change our strategy. I believe that this will come from a good dialogue provided by a space like RCM. This has given us the opportunity to have exchanges with other spaces, even at the international level. So I think that aren't something that we have a lot to gain in these spaces. And we have to keep taking into account that we have the resources, but maybe we're not aiming at the best solutions or the correct solutions. Now we have Dominican Republic. And William Charpentier from Dominican Republic, related to the regional policy on migration. We know that we have imbalances in economic legislative levels, but we think that the COVID pandemic, it is an essential topic to take into account. So we start at the RCM a process for a regional migration policy, because what we were able to see in this pandemic is that some countries in the region accepted vaccinating everyone in their territory. However, other countries are not doing that. So the leadership of the RCM could help us with this very current issue of the pandemic to start with a process of standardization, harmonization regarding the response to COVID by providing assistance to everybody in the territory. And this response can, of course, take into account the different aspects of the different countries. There are differences, but we have an issue like the pandemic that can allow us to then provide assistance with solidarity. So each country can start with an understanding and provide everyone who is in the territory of the countries in the region access to the vaccine without discrimination. Thank you, Dominican Republic. And on this topic, I would also like to ask you if the working plan on migration and health proposed by the PPT, and there's one that has been proposed by the pandemic, but we have a workshop plan for migration and health in the Americas, and border protection is going to have a session on migration and COVID-19. We still have a few more minutes, so we still have a few more comments before closing this session. So you can still take the floor. And Mr. Rubén Chávez, please. Thank you. I'm Rubén Chávez from the Migration Policy Unit here in Mexico. And it's very interesting about the issues of the pillars of an integrated regional policy. I would summarize these pillars. First of all, it has to fully respect human rights. Second, try to address the causes for migration in the region of origin. Also, address the needs for international protection and the respect of the principle of non-return. And another one would be to fulfill the needs or assist all the different components of the flows. And we need this within a regional framework and strategy, very important. And even this unfortunate circumstance of the pandemic can become an opportunity for us to propose a regional strategy. So we have an effective, integrated regional migration policy. Thank you. Thank you, Rubén. Dominican Republic, do you want to intervene again? Yeah. I'm Naomi Arboleda from the Ministry of International Affairs, Office of International Affairs of the Ministry of Women. We want to say that the experiences presented by all the presenters have been great and would like to congratulate our income. And we undoubtedly understand that driving actions from a national space towards an articulated space for the promotion of regional strategies will allow us to address this international and regional phenomenon. As mentioned by Graciela, I think, before, exchanging best practices would allow us to see these common elements that may serve as references where we have experiences that can be suitable for our regulatory realities. Others may not be as pertinent, but it's a great opportunity to build and work on this regional policy. And as part of the Ministry of Women, we deem it extremely important the participation and integration of national instruments, given the increase and the feminization of migration flows. And we are concerned that more and more women and children are deciding to migrate. And this dynamic has to be seen with a gender perspective from the lens of intersectionality and diversity to understand this differentiated impact of the migration process on these particular populations and the reasons why they are embarking on these migration flows and the actions the states can carry out also in collaboration with other states. Also very important, we need and we deem very important to construct these regional policy from a multi-sector point of view with the pillars involving both regional and national spheres and all organizations that work with women that should be involved, especially dealing with women and more vulnerable populations. And this space for dialogue, it is a great space to start with the construction of these articulated responses. And we would like to thank everybody for the invitation. Thank you, Naomi, for the intervention. If we have any other intervention, you can raise your hand or open your camera and microphone. What or with the previous reflection, it would be a good exercise to have a dialogue on what regional migration response or strategy would be and what we have not expressed before. It would be very good exercise for the RCM to have the guidelines of what these dynamics would be. And I think that somebody would like to ask for the floor, Honduras, and effectively, it is very pertinent what Vinicius said. To be able to structure a regional migration policy is very important, but we also have to tie it to the policies of each country so they have an effective response. And in Honduras, we are preparing this migration policy for the country. So it would be very important to be very clear about the regional aspect. So I think it is very timely what ARNCOM is mentioning. And we are more than willing to participate. Thank you. Good day. Lidia Núñez and Eugenia Victor. I'm Lidia Núñez. I come from Honduras. I'm with the Secretariat of Health and regarding the international strategies and policies. And now we are also working on the national migration policy where we are trying to have together with other institutions, an integrated management of this, working on indicators of impact, expected results, and the development of an integrated policy where we from health would like to have a standardized, harmonized assistance to have a better authorization and research regarding the assistance that we can provide to these vulnerable populations that we have at the border. Also to strengthen the capabilities to be able to approach these uh, migration matters between public, private sector, international cooperation, and civil society. As we said before, we are now working on incorporating this migration policy to have it more efficient and to have a better attention for migrant populations. And for us, we're also articulating this and having different institutions that we're working with to be able to handle this issue of migration. Thank you
Gracias,
and
José
good
María, y
day.
gracias, Honduras, por estas intervenciones. Y a continuación,
Thank you, Honduras. Now, Costa Rica. Eugenia, you have the floor. Morning, all. Can you hear me?
adelante.
As Luis Alonso said, I'm Eugenia Victor from Directorate of Migration of Costa Rica. What's important? Very important that this discussion space. We really want to congratulate them about you because they're more and more important because migration dynamics are changing more and more rapidly, and the challenges faced by countries of origin, transit, and destination more and more complex, and especially dealing the attention that we have to provide to different populations and taking into account different even felonies that may be committed. But related to these policies, I think it is very important. Costa Rica has a big trajectory. We have a migration policy of 2013, and now we are starting to work on the next migration policy. And it is not defining a policy at the level of the countries, and we are advancing to that. What we need to do is to bring these other challenges to our policies. And I consider that what we have to do is maximize the efforts being carried out in other regional spaces and include them. I am both in OCAM and RCM, but PINE-SITA, for example, also contemplates a regional policy, and also what was mentioned, how this policy can be articulated in, in a way with the policies of the countries. And Costa Rica has been one that has defended this issue mostly according to the particular characteristics of each country and taking into account the characteristic and migration dynamics of the country. Some countries can have one, two, three, or four other characteristics of migration. And we can build on what has already been established so we can maximize all these previous and current efforts. Because we have discussed this in several fora, and the RCM is that even as a region, the RCM cannot fight alone against all the challenges brought about by migration flows because we have other people. For example, the SACM can be added so we can work jointly together. So I invite everybody to analyze whether this is necessary, what we have, and to strengthen what we have, to maximize efforts and resources. And something that I really liked, and I think our last colleague told us, managing by objectives or by results. We need to see how effective they are, the objectives, or if they, for example, getting to our target populations. Thank you. Thank you, Eugenia, Costa Rica. I think your hand is raised from the previous, or do you want to take the floor again? If we have, yeah, it is. Don't worry. We have no more interventions. I am going to give the floor to the working group on regular mass migration. So we will start with Gustavo. And dear colleagues, I think that today's session has been quite fruitful. One of the important aspects that we have basic needs that we are considering here is the need to have a regional strategy to address the migration phenomenon throughout the region. This is to try to work it in all the different dimensions with a regional strategy. And what others have said in previous participations is that this strategy has to put front and center the human rights of migrants and the sovereignty of the member countries. And we have efforts from OCAM, we're doing that. And in this working group on regular mass migration, we are working on an integrated strategy for regular mass migration. And we hope that when we have a first draft of proposal, we will have your comments and suggestions. And as we said before, we don't have to start from scratch. So we can have all these inputs, and once we have all this regional strategy, we would really like to have, of course, all your comments to strengthen this proposal and put to the consideration of the RCM and the meeting of vice ministers a robust strategy to address irregular mass migration, trying to mitigate this situation with which we are living. We cannot address migration without considering the origin of it and also the process of integration and reintegration of people within the context of human mobility. So we can have agreements and have a strategy in a joint fashion. That would be all.
Muchas gracias, Gustavo.
Thank you.
Rita, te paso la palabra.
Muchísimas gracias. Pues
So,
efectivamente ha sido muy interesante poder escuchar todas estas ideas.
Rita, you
Sabemos
have the
que
floor.
toda la
Thank you.
región
It's been
tiene
very
unos
interesting to
desafíos
listen to this
específicos tanto
idea.
para la
We
protección
see
social como para la
old
asistencia a
and
las
new
personas que viven
challenges
en
faced by the
contextos
region,
migratorios. Debido a las
especially to
complejidades
provide
que implican
assistance
los
to the
flujos
people within
migratorios
the context of
irregulares
migration,
en la región.
especially due
Por
to
una
the
parte
increase of
tenemos el
migration
aumento de
flows in
los
the
flujos
region.
extrarregionales,
We
los
have
cambios
increase in
climáticos
extra-regional
y climáticos.
flows, the changes
Todo
in the
esto
composition of
detonaba la
these
necesidad de
flows,
contar con una
and
mayor
others have
capacitación y de poder
shown
garantizar la
the
atención a las
need
personas
for more
en
training
contextos
and better
migratorios.
assistance
Por
of
otra
people
parte,
within the
pues
context of
contamos en un
migration.
contexto de pandemia que ha
We're
traído
also
muchos
in the context of
desafíos
a
en el fenómeno
pandemic,
migratorio, particularmente en términos del tema que veníamos
and
mencionando
what we have been
sobre
discussing, we've
comportamientos
seen
xenofóbicas y
an
discriminatorias desde la
increase in
cultura de la
discrimination and
discriminación, lo
xenophobic
cual pues puede ser por
attitudes,
ignorancia, por
which can
desconocimiento o por
be due
diversos factores.
to
Pero de
fear
igual
or
manera,
ignorance
también
or
la
other
pandemia
factors.
ha dejado algunos
But the
aprendizajes que
pandemic has
necesitamos
also
llevar a
given
cabo.
us
Es importante
some
tener estrategias homologadas para
lessons
la
learned.
prevención y la
We
respuesta a
need
procesos migratorios que
standardized
lleven a
or
mejoras
at
en el
least
rendimiento ocupacional
harmonized
de todas las
strategies for
personas para
assistance
tener acceso a la
so
salud,
everybody
a
can
la
have
salud
access
general
to
y a la
health
vacunación de manera
care
particular en
and
este
especially
contexto.
vaccination.
Ya se mencionaba también en el intercambio de
And
documentos
especially
para
within
establecer
this
una
context,
estrategia de
we also need
documentación
a
regional que
strategy
permita
for
garantizar
regional
un tránsito seguro y
documentation
ordenado de las personas
for
migrantes
safe and
a
orderly
través del
transit of
fortalecimiento de los sistemas
migrants,
de regularización.
as well as
Se mencionaba también la
strengthening
necesidad
of
de
the
involucrar a
regularization
diferentes
models
sectores para poder
to
definir una
involve different
política
sectors
migratoria
to
regional
define a
que pueda
regional
incluir
migration
un
policy that
análisis de los
includes
diferentes perfiles y
an analysis
necesidades
of
de
the
la
different
población
profiles and
migrante.
needs of the
Pero
migrant
también se hace
population,
énfasis en la necesidad de combatir
and
las causas
also the
estructurales que
need
motivan la
to
migración, dar
address
comprender los
the
procesos
cause of
migratorios
migration and try to
en cada
understand
uno de todos
migration
sus aspectos.
processes
Habría que pensar también
with
en acciones
all
concretas
their
que combatan tanto los factores
aspects
internos como los
and
externos que inciden en
internal
los
and external
procesos de
factors
discriminación contra las personas.
that
Pensar en
can
este combate de la
result in
corrupción, como se decía,
aspects like a
estrategias que
discrimination,
combaten la discriminación a nivel
combat
local,
of
pensar
corruption,
tal vez en campañas de
discrimination at the
sensibilización
local
a las
level,
autoridades locales
awareness
acerca
raising
de beneficios
campaigns in
del
host
desconocimiento y
communities to
discriminación,
try
pensar en
to
informar a las
prevent
personas migrantes sobre los
xenophobic
programas de
and
transporte de
discriminatory
asistencia,
practices,
promover la regularización
inform
de su
migrants
ciudadanía
about
o
any
documentación
programs
para
of which they
eliminar
may be
situaciones de
beneficiaries,
irregularidad
and other
que
actions to
coloque a las
try
personas en mayor
to
situación de
address
vulnerabilidad
this situation
y
of
pueden
irregularity that places
sufrir
these people
discriminación.
in a more vulnerable situation
Se rescataba también la
and
importancia de
also
pensar en
a high risk of
estrategias de
discrimination.
acciones colaborativas y
In
estrategias de
addition,
inclusión desde una
collaboration
perspectiva de género
strategies
para
that
profundizar en las
have a gender
necesidades de las
perspective
mujeres migrantes y poder garantizar su
to
protección y
address the
visibilización,
needs of
especialmente pensando que existen
women,
demandas
migrants,
irregulares en los
especially
flujos migratorios.
taking into account that
Fuera de
the
todo
presence
esto, es
has
importante
increased in
también
the
recordar
flows
de nueva cuenta
lately.
que la igualdad y la
And
no
we must
discriminación
not
deben
lose
deben
sight
ser
as that
reconocidos como
inequality
principios sobre
and
los que se basan los
discrimination
derechos humanos.
are
De lo que
contrary
cabe
to human
abundar
rights.
es que todas
So
estas situaciones
non-discrimination
están poniendo a prueba
and
la
equality
estrategia de
are the
las
pillars
políticas y
on
la
which we have
capacidad
to
de dar
build
respuesta
our
en contextos de migración en
assistance
casi toda la
to
región.
migrants,
Pero
including our border
dentro
management.
de lo
And
importante que es pensar en esta
we
estrategia para
have
toda la región,
to think
es
about
definir
a regional
homologaciones y principios estandarizados
strategy for
que al mismo
assistance
tiempo respondan a las
with
necesidades de todos y
harmonized
cada uno de los países y
processes
que
that
permitan
respond to the needs
adaptarse
of
a
the
sus
different
respectivos
countries
buscando responder
and
a necesidades
to
diferenciadas
have
que
us
se han
think as a
identificado
region,
en estos flujos irregulares.
especially when dealing with
Como
differentiated
parte de
aspects
esta
of these
política
new
regional se
migration
puede
flows. As
pensar
part
en
of
que
this
los espacios seguros y
regional
refuerzos
policy,
internacionales y
we can
regionales
also try to leverage
es importante
other
trabajar de manera
international
conjunta.
and regional efforts so we
Y será
can
fundamental que los países de la
address
región sigan
this
trabajando en alianza
phenomenon in
para
a
la
coordinated
identificación de
fashion.
perfiles de
We need
personas
to
particularmente
continue
vulnerables con las
with the
prioridades
identification of
en que el tema
profiles
del
of
derecho a
particularly
acceso,
vulnerable
protección,
populations
igualdad
so they
y
can
apoyo
also
son
exercise their
derechos de vida
rights
para todas las
in
personas.
conditions
Es
of
decir,
equality.
es necesario basar la atención
It
y la
is
participación
necessary
en
to
políticas
base
regionales
assistance on a
que atiendan las
differentiated
necesidades de
approach
las personas en
that
contextos de
identify the
migración.
needs
Y también resulta muy
of the
importante
people in different
invertir de
contexts
manera
of migration and
permanente en espacios
vulnerability,
como el que
but with
tenemos
equal
hoy
exercise of
y
rights.
los
And
principios básicos que
we
deben
have
orientar
to
las
disseminate
acciones de
the basic
procesos
principles that
migratorios
have to orient the
el primer
actions
contacto, especialmente
of
desde que es el
first
primer contacto de las
contact
personas en contextos de
officers
migración,
or
promover el
personnel
pleno respeto de sus
within the
derechos
context of
humanos a
migration
partir de un enfoque
in full
democrático,
respect of of migrants' human rights and with no discrimination.
solo agregar
And to close, I would like to add
efectivamente ha sido muy
that this exchange of ideas has been
nota de lo que se
very
ha dicho con el
nutritious, if you will. We have taken note so we can prepare this general report with recommendations. And also we will incorporate anything that we did see in the next two workshops, tomorrow and Wednesday. Thank you. Thank you, Rita. And to close today, we have Miguel Ángel Aguilar again, coordinator of the Migration Study Centers of the Secretariat of the Interior, on behalf of the PPT. Thank you. Effectively, we are closing this session on strengthening of intergovernmental policies for migration management. As we've said before, it is essential and it has challenges for the region as a whole and for specifically for the country. So we have to address it in a joint fashion. I would like to thank ARNCOM for the valuable support. Also the Executive Secretariat for their work, the moderation, our partner institutions in Mexico, and all of you who have participated. Tomorrow, as Rita said, the session will be facilitated by the International Red Cross. We will see use of force and protection to migrant population, which is one of our recurrent themes, especially involving those who defend the use and abuse of force, and compared to us who are advocating for unrestricted support of human rights. Then on Friday, we are going to have a workshop on assisted returns within the context of crisis, which is going to be with the IOM. So from the unit of migration policy registration and population of the Secretariat of the Interior of Mexico, we will continue having cooperation dynamics with different countries in order to provide assistance to people in context of mobility. And the last collective that is always discriminated against is always migrants. And as a PPT, Mexico is willing to recognize different practices to provide decent treatment to migrants. We have to acknowledge there is discrimination, xenophobia, and racism of which these populations are subjected to. When we're talking with the region framework of migration governance and human rights, in other words, migration with inclusion, the governments have to protect the rights and provide non-discriminatory treatment. These are the principles and the way to allow them to exercise their rights. And not only the government, the society as a whole has to have a different view of the order, of the other. Civil society, businesses, religious organizations, and even academia have to join in with these efforts. Migration has to be understood within a broader scope, including inclusion and integration. Yesterday we had the World Day of Refugees. She said, the Nicaraguan refugee in Mexico, said, I am Mexico also. And this should be the spirit of our work. Migrants will be a part of more and more multicultural and more dynamic society. From the PPT and despite the pandemic, we are creating regional frameworks for assistance within a scope of equality, involving the countries of origin, transit, destination, and return. And we are committed to respecting the rights of all migrants. An indispensable principle is to fight prejudice. The importance of working together constantly to eliminate these practices that have to be acknowledged first and which are recurrent in our countries. So from the working group on irregular mass migration, we are exhorting the member countries of the RCM to strengthen the principles of equality and non-discrimination towards migrants and to promote measures for the identification of special needs for protection, especially those in especially vulnerable situations. We hope this training activity has a positive effect in each of the countries and the knowledge is replicated, especially with the commitment of eliminating discriminatory practices. The PPT is contemplating other activities in this regard, and we insist there is the need to incorporate in every action of the countries as well as agreements and partnership to be able to build a regional migration policy. The exercise of human rights by migrants must always be above any political agenda, regardless of the migration status or strategies. So we hope that this and the other sessions will be fruitful. If there's nothing else, I would like to close this first session on the intergovernmental strategies for strengthening migration governance.
Recuerden que el enlace es el mismo por
Thank
el
you.
cual se
We are waiting for you tomorrow. Same link will work tomorrow, same time. And the trigger question for tomorrow will be shared this afternoon. Please wait for an email from us. And the dialogue will be facilitated by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Thank you all. The PPT are come. Madam Gonzalez, thank you for your assistance today.